So for today's video, I want to talk about what happened to the bodies of the victims of the Titanic. Are their bodies still down on the seafloor? What happened to the ones that were at the surface? I want to go into a little bit of detail as to what happened after the Titanic had sank, after the last victim was lost, and the survivors have been rescued. What happened to their bodies and where were they put to rest, if they were put to rest at all? One of my favorite lines from the movie Titanic is 1,500 people went into the sea when Titanic sank from under us. What happened to those 1,500 people? So, on the morning of April 15th, once the last survivor was brought on board the Carpathia, they had their memorial service and decided that they should head to New York. It was said that they themselves had only seen one body, with the exception of a couple of bodies left in a lifeboat that they had died throughout the night. So once White Star Line had confirmed that there had been a great loss of life during the sinking, they immediately knew something was going to have to get done to recover some of the bodies. So this is where a small town of Halifax, Nova Scotia, play a huge part in the Titanic story. The reason being, this town was the closest port to the wreck site of the Titanic that could handle bringing in the bodies of the victims. It was 750 miles from the wreck site of the Titanic. A cable laying ship called the Mckay Bennett had been chartered by White Star Line to go out and recover the bodies of the victims. It was captained by Captain Frederick Lartner, and it was him and 75 other local men who went out to do the job of recovering these bodies. And they were paid double wages because they knew that this was going to be a huge emotional toll on the crew. I think at one point it was even said that Captain Lardner doubled the rum rations that the crew was allowed when he knew they were getting close to where the bodies of the victims was going to lie. So on April the 17th, 2 days after the sinking of the Titanic, the Mckay Bennett left Halifax, Nova Scotia with 103 coffins on board and embalming fluid for 70 bodies. Now, even if you're bad at math like me, you might be hearing this and thinking, wait a minute, 1,500 people, 70 bodies worth of embalming fluid, and 103 coffins. There is no way that that's enough. But the sad truth of the matter is that nobody really knew what to expect when going to recover these bodies. It was definitely suspected that a lot of people went down inside of the vessel herself, and it was also thought that a lot of the victims would have drifted apart because with the currents, it was possible that the bodies could drift up to 40 miles in a day. And I know that may sound a bit dramatic, like, oh my God, that's a huge amount of distance for a body to have to drift. You have to understand that currents can be very strong. And I myself, working on boats, I have seen currents that have moved at a speed that absolutely amazed me. And I just thought, wow, if I fell into this, by the time anyone can get help, you'll be far away from the area that you entered the water in. So I think that thinking of the predators in the water, thinking of the people that went down with the ship, and thinking about the currents, they just didn't really expect much to be left there when they arrived. Now, as the Mckay Bennett was sailing to the site of the disaster, on land in Halifax, John Henry Barnstead was busy at work trying to get everything together for when the bodies came back. He had all the mortuaries in the town cleared out. He came up with a system where every single body would be given a number. And with that number, there would be a description of the body, there would be a description of the clothing that they had, and there will be a little canvas bag that will contain the little articles and effects that were found on them. So pocket watches, pens, pen knives, wallets, anything that was found on their person, that would go into the canvas bag. The clothes themselves will be destroyed to prevent souvenir hunters. Because at this time, there really wasn't a great system for organizing bodies and trying to get them buried or identified whenever you had a mass casualty event like this. So he was coming up with this system to try to prevent souvenir hunters because he knew there were going to be people. And I mean, to me, that just seems pretty low to steal clothes off of a deceased body. But he knew that that was something at that time that happened quite a bit whenever you had a historic event like this take place. So I appreciate the fact that he put so much time and effort into trying to not just properly identify these bodies so that the families might could get some sort of closure, but to also pay respect for them and make sure that they weren't robbed from the grave by souvenir hunters. He really put his all and put his dedication of his work into trying to make sure that this went as smoothly as it possibly could. Now, as you probably would have guessed, there would have had to have been an undertaker on board for the embalming of these bodies. And the man that had that responsibility on the Mckay Bennett was Jon Snow. I had to research that a couple of times because I cannot help the urge but to say, like, you know nothing, Jon Snow. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Back to being serious. It's just every time I hear that name, I can't help but say that. Jon Snow was the Undertaker who was in charge of dealing with the bodies that they recovered. And once they got there, they actually saw more bodies than what they were expecting. They were actually surprised at how the bodies were clustered together. Me personally, I think that might have to do with how the victims actually spent their last moments alive. Anytime I read about a shipwreck and someone that was pulled from the water, it tends to be kind of a thing of human nature where when people fall off of a sinking vessel, they either go to a piece of wreckage or they go to a group of people that they see. Because I do believe that increases your chances of being spotted and being rescued. So these clusters of people, I think that might have been just the currents carrying them, and the clusters that they were in when they were recovered were the same groups that they were in whenever they were going through their last moments of life. That's just my personal opinion, but that was one of the things from the journals that were kept that was mentioned. First day of the Mckay Bennett's crew going out to recover these bodies, they recovered the body of about a 2 to 3 year old child. And it's a little blonde haired boy, and they don't know anything about him. There's no thing on a baby, obviously. There's no wallet or anything like that to suggest what the child's name is. And the baby was found by himself. And this had a huge emotional impact on the crew. They themselves would actually use some of their money to buy an actual tombstone for this baby. Now, in the last decade, this child has been identified as 2 year old Sidney Goodwin. He was traveling with his parents and six other siblings, and unfortunately, none of them survived. And to my knowledge, his body was the only body from that family that was recovered. So, on the morning of April the 30th, 15 days after the sinking of the Titanic, the Mckay Bennett sailed past McNabb's Island, and the cathedral bells started to toll. Once this was heard, it announced to Halifax that it was now sailing in with the bodies of the deceased from the Titanic, so over 40 more church bells tolled to pay respect to the victims. Now, while she was out, the Mckay Bennett had recovered 306 bodies, but once she sailed into Halifax, she only had 190 on board. This was due to the fact that most of them were buried at sea, mainly because of either they were in a rough shape from how they decayed in the water, if certain scavengers or predators maybe have gotten hold, or in some cases, the way that they left the ship. If they were badly crushed or badly hurt whenever the vessel was sinking, then their bodies might not have been in the best of condition, and it was thought better to bury them at sea. And it was also because they didn't really prepare themselves to carry that many bodies. So after the Mckay Bennett docked in Halifax, it took 3.5 hours to unload the bodies. They were then sent to an ice rink. And the reason that they were sent there is because this was the only place that was big enough and cold enough to accommodate that many bodies. Now, of the bodies that had been recovered, you had Titanic's wealthiest passenger, John Jacob Astor, Titanic's band leader, Wallace Hartley. He was actually still found holding on to the violin that he is famously known for playing Nearer My God to Thee as the ship sank. Another body was Alma Paulson, a third-class mother traveling alone, bringing her kids over to meet her husband, who had immigrated a year prior. So there was a mixture of passengers who had been found, and it was such a somber feeling that hung over Halifax. That is one of the things that I read in the different reports and the different journals that people kept, was just, it was a quiet, somber feeling. Now, I have to clarify that even though they sent out ships to retrieve the bodies of victims within a few days of the sinking, I mean, within 48 hours, the first one left, there was still sightings of bodies months after the sinking. I've read about people that saw women still clinging to their children. There was a report of one woman who was still holding on to her dog. I guess they wouldn't let the dog into the lifeboat, so she decided to stay back with it. There were reports of bodies being found. There was even one where there was a lifeboat that was found a month later, a couple of 100 miles away from where the Titanic had originally sank, and there was still a couple of bodies left inside of it. So there was some bodies that were found because they had been scattered out throughout the shipping lanes. The 150 bodies that were never sent to loved ones were eventually buried in Halifax in 3 local cemeteries. Till this day, 40 of those victims still remain unidentified. So some of you may be wondering, what happened to the victims that went down with the ship? What happened to the people who weren't fortunate enough to even make it to the upper decks? Well, by the time the wreck was found in 1985, enough of time had passed that most traces of the victims on the seafloor had broken back down to nature. The only thing that gives away that there was once a body there is shoes. That's because the leather that these shoes is made out of causes them to be a lot more resilient in the ocean water than a lot of other things, which means that all throughout you will see the shoes of where the victims' bodies had sank down to on that night. All right, that's my video on what happened to the bodies of the victims of the Titanic. Come back next time and we'll dig some more into the Titanic and her passengers. Have a good one.